Hey, this is Colin at Shift Synth 1. This is my second lesson on the low frequency oscillator. Today we're going to wrap up the low frequency oscillator, and I'm going to point out a few additional items that relate to the low frequency oscillator that I think everyone should be aware of. I'm actually going to start with those today because they're kind of awkward. They don't really fit within the spectrum of the low frequency oscillator, but they can be extremely confusing, so I just want to clear those up to begin with so that we can dive into the low frequency oscillator section afterwards. So I've initialized the patch here, and I want to point out a few things when it comes to the mod matrix section. So I'm going to open up the source here, and as you can see, there's two low frequency oscillator settings here. There's a plus and a plus minus. Now when I first started studying the patch editor, I thought that plus meant the low frequency oscillator just went up, and that plus minus meant that it went up and down. This is an incorrect assumption. Low frequency oscillator 1 plus means the low frequency oscillator starts on the tone that you press. Low frequency oscillator plus minus means that the low frequency oscillator oscillates around the tone. And I can show you guys this pretty easily using that tuner. So if I go to my tuner here and I assign the low frequency oscillator 1 plus to the oscillator 1 pitch, and I turn this up to, let's say, 7, and then you will see that when I press this C, it will start at C and go up and then down since it's a sine wave. So if I select the low frequency oscillator plus minus, it will start below the note of C and go above the note of C. So that's basically the difference between the two. And you can extrapolate the meaning of that to each low frequency oscillator destination. If it's the pulse width index, the plus minus will start below your setting and go up to a position above it. If it's plus, it'll just start on the position you currently have it set at and go above it. And that works for every single one of these. So the second housekeeping item that I want to address is modulating the speed of the low LFO. Now this is something that's very common. You'll want to do this in your own patch development. You'll see it in presets all the time. It's fun to modulate the speed of low frequency oscillators. What's counterintuitive is if you assign it as a rate or a rate sync. And I'm going to get into rate sync a little bit later, but rate sync basically means that you're timing the LFO to the internal clock of the Novation circuit. Rate is a clock independent of the clock on the Novation circuit. It's still a standard clock, but it's not tied to the tempo of the circuit. So adjusting the rate is very straightforward. Basically, you're just adjusting this knob. So if I take the destination and I set this to LFO 1 rate, and I have the low frequency oscillator assigned to this oscillator 1 pitch, I've got a depth of 11, and the rate's at 68. So if I turn the depth all the way up here, as I turn the position, it will increase this rate knob until the low frequency oscillator starts to create a tone. So let's see what that tone sounds like. So what happens if you have rate sync? Now if I go to the macro 2 here and I select the options, you'll see that LFO 1 rate synchronization is an option. So if we click on that and then I assign, let's say I do seconds. I'll get into this in a little bit. But if I assign a rate to the rate sync, it automatically negates the rate set here. So this is 0. So I'm going to go ahead and set that to 0 just to clear any confusion. And we're going to test out what this sounds like. All right. So what happens if I modulate that using macro knob 2? I'm not entirely sure what that is doing, but it's not what I would expect it to do. What I would expect it to do is cycle up this list, which is not what is happening. So if I were to go up, I would expect it to go to 4th dotted, 1 plus 1/3 beats, 4th, 8th, 4th. It's not doing that. It's skipping around on me. So that's not a reliable parameter. So how do people compensate for this? Well, what you'll see in presets is that people will assign a source of direct to the LFO1 rate. And this is a much more predictable way to change the speed of rate sync. So if I change the macro 2 parameter to mod matrix 2, we'll start with a second rate sync. And then as I adjust it, it's still really sensitive because, as we discussed earlier, mod depths are incredibly sensitive to adjustments with the low frequency oscillator. So let me take the depth here way down. I'm going to take it down to 15. And then we're going to try this again. Now that's a lot better. That sounds pretty good. So that's a way to compensate for the issues with adjusting the macro knob directly to the rate synchronization. So keep that in mind, guys. So moving on, I want to address the rate synchronization parameters next. When you pull it up, it opens up a really intense list. I'm going to do a whole series on the Novation circuit, but as a general rule, as someone starting to use this device, you should think of every single one of the pads in the sequencer as a 16th note, or 1/16 of one bar. One bar would be 4 beats, right? So each of these contains 4 beats and is divided into 4 subdivisions of each beat. So if you think about it like that, the fourth is referring to 1 cycle per 1 beat, or 4 cycles in 1 bar, which is, in musical terms, a quarter note, right? So just to give you guys an example of what that is, I will turn on the metronome here. I have a drum for every quarter note going. And if I trigger a note on the first beat, it will cycle 4 times in 1 bar. Basically, there were 4 cycles in 1 bar. So starting from that position, if you look at this as 4 cycles per 1 bar, 8th would be 8 cycles per 1 bar, 16 is 16 cycles per 1 bar, or 1 cycle per pad, and 32 is 2 cycles per pad. So then you can do the same thing going up. Second is half notes, which is 2 cycles per 1 bar, and then 4 beats is 1 cycle per 1 bar. So let me try that out. 4 beats. 2, 3, 4. There you go. So if we understand what is going on with the 4ths, 8ths, 16ths, 32nd, and then 4 beats, what is it that's in between here? Now they call them triplets, but really if you do the math calc, it's 1/2 of the speed between these two. And then dotted is just another form of subdivision. So if you guys refer to the manual that I have, it actually spells out the number of cycles per bars or beats for each of these parameters. When we get up here to 21 through 36, that's just referring to 1 cycle per that many beats. So 1 cycle per 21 beats through 1 cycle per 36 beats. So it's just a real slow, low frequency oscillator. So in the last lesson, we covered the difference between free running and key synced. Phase offset is only applicable when key synced is activated. Phase offset refers to where in the cycle of the low frequency oscillator the LFO enters each time a key is pressed. The best way to illustrate this is just using a square wave. So I'm going to take all of these parameters back to default so we have a clear picture of what is going on. I'm going to set the source to LFO1 plus and take oscillator 1 pitch. I'm going to turn the rate sync off and adjust the rate manually. So if I play this note, you can see that the square wave is entering on the bottom of the LFO. So if I set the phase offset to 60, it should enter in at the top of the square wave. That's what the phase offset does. So I'm going to take the phase offset back down. Slew rate takes the low frequency oscillator wave and rounds the edges of it. So if you were to use a square wave but turn up the slew rate, it would slowly turn it into a sine wave. So let me show you how that sounds like. Delay refers to the intensity of the fade-in mode. Fade-in mode refers to 4 ways in which the LFO is applied to the sound. Fade-in means that the low-frequency oscillator starts at 0 and then slowly fades into the sound. So let me show you what that sounds like. If I set it at fade-in and then turn up the delay, you can hear it start at 0 and then slowly fade in. And you can see it on the tuner. Fade out means it does the opposite. It starts at the full depth of the LFO and then will fade out. Gate in means that it will delay by a certain amount of time and then abruptly come in. And gate out means that it will come in at full depth and then abruptly stop. So delay just adjusts the fade mode parameter manually. Delay sync puts the fade mode on the internal clock of the Novation circuit. And the dropdown is exactly the same as the rate sync dropdown. It follows the same rules. So let's say if I set this to second and have a gate in mode, actually, you can see that it waited 2 beats before starting. Just like the rate sync, if the delay sync is set to a parameter, then the delay is turned off. So this might as well have been 0. Delay trigger is only applicable in mono mode. So I'm going to turn the polyphony mode to mono, which means I can only play one note at a time on the circuit. It will not do chords. Delay trigger means that if I play a note in mono mode and then another note, it will not re-trigger the fade-in mode. So let me show you how that works. I'll play a note. So it faded in. I'm going to play another note now. It just jumped in on the low frequency oscillator already running. So if I turn this to multi, that means that it will re-trigger the fade-in mode every time I press a new note. So it triggered in, and it created another fade-in mode there. One shot just means that the low-frequency oscillator will trigger for one cycle. If I press a note here, it will just do one cycle and then stop. So that's really useful for the wave shape of the piano envelope. And I mentioned this in the last lesson. The piano envelope is a really great way to make the Novation circuit sound like keys. I'm going to take the gate mode to fade in, and I'm actually going to turn off the delay. It's best to turn the rate sync on to like an 8th note. So I don't know, it's a subtle thing, but it can sound really good if it's applied correctly. So that just about covers the low frequency oscillator section, guys. Between the low frequency oscillator and the oscillator section, that's the bulk of the functionality of the circuit editor. So the rest of this should go pretty quickly. Feel free to leave me a comment if you have any questions. I'd be happy to get back to you. Alright, I'll see you guys in the next lesson.